I'm Steven from PM Lesson. I'm here with Sushant. Sushant, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, hey everyone, my name's Dashant. I'm a current computer science student studying at Columbia University. I'm going to be joining Google as a product manager intern for the upcoming summer. Over the past years, I've had a good amount of product experience, worked at a startup called HealthTap in the Bay Area for 3 months, worked at Microsoft as a PM intern for 3 months. Um, so have a good amount of experience in this space and interviewing and generally working across different product groups. I'm really excited to kind of share um, participate in this live session right now.
Awesome, cool, and it's great that you got the Google offer and you're really excited to join. And I'm sure you did really great things during your interview to land that. So it'll be great for everyone listening in to kind of hear from that experience. Generally, just to give the audience a sense of what we're doing here, we're doing a PM lesson live mock interview where I interview folks and we use it as an educational session. I'm going to interview Sushant and then give him some feedback after so you can get a sense of that. But Sushant obviously has been doing a great job at interviews. Congratulations, Sushant. And so it'll be a great opportunity to see how Sushant also thinks through these kinds of questions. Cool. Well, Sushant, do you have any questions or comments before we jump in?
No, I'm ready to get started.
All right, cool. So the first question that I wanted to ask you was, if you were the product manager for WhatsApp, how would you improve WhatsApp?
Got it. Before we go ahead, I have a few clarifying questions I'd like to ask.
Sure.
Number one, are there any specific goals we're thinking about when it comes to improving WhatsApp? Like, are we thinking about improving user acquisition, user engagement, monetization, or is that something you'd like me to define?
I would like you to define it, but if I had to lean somewhere with the opportunities that you listed, I would say that monetization is not one of our current goals right now. We're still in the phase of growing and getting user engagement.
Got it. The second question I had was, is there any specific customer segment that we're interested in targeting, or is that something you'd like for me to define as well?
I would like you to define the target segment for improving WhatsApp. WhatsApp is obviously clearly a very global company and product, so I would like to see, maybe how you think about it, and I'm happy to nudge you in the right direction throughout the interview.
Sounds great. So to get started, the first thing I'd like to kind of think about is what are the possible goals the goal that we're going to set here. So right now I'm thinking about a few things. One is like, how do we improve user acquisition? Like, how do we onboard more new users onto the platform? Is there any customer segment that we're maybe not targeting? Is there something we could improve in our product to make it easier for users to get on? The second goal I'm thinking about is user engagement. That is, there's a lot of users that are already on WhatsApp. I think there's about roughly a billion users right now on the platform. The question is, how do we make sure those users are having a better user experience? How do we make sure they're spending more time on the platform, starting more of their conversations through WhatsApp? So between these two, I think I am more interested in focusing on the user engagement piece just because I think WhatsApp already has such a big market share. And I think the focus right now should be really to dial down and create a much more positive user experience for people already on the platform. Like, how do we think about specific customer segments that might not be using the platform as well as we'd like, or they might not be spending as much time on the platform, and how do we strengthen that user experience for them? Does that sound good?
Yep, that sounds great. So we're going to focus on user engagement for the purpose of this question in terms of how to improve that as our goal, right?
Yeah. So the next thing I'd like to do is maybe think of a few potential customer segments. So if you could give me a moment or two to kind of list out my ideas and then go from there.
Cool, sounds good. And again, for those who are just joining in, thanks for coming onto the session. You are more than encouraged to comment, to give thoughts, to give reactions. It helps us as we go through the interview. So if you are watching, please do comment and kind of chime in. You can even ask Sushant follow-up questions on my behalf to Sushant if you'd like, and that's a great way to practice your product management interview. So you are strongly, strongly encouraged. I see the four of you who are currently watching in to kind of participate, and I think some more will trickle in as the session goes on.
Got it. So I do have a few customer segments in mind right now. The first one I'm thinking about are children, generally like elementary school to junior high children, where parents often want to restrict their child's usage so that they can only maybe message a few people from a specific designated period. There's often a tendency for they want like a more like essentially a child version of WhatsApp where they can kind of restrict the number of hours they could use it. They could restrict who they could send messages to while they're at school, just to make sure that they're not getting distracted and spending too much time texting and not focusing on school. So I think that's one potential segment to think about. The second segment I'm thinking about is elderly people. So for them, often the big issue with a lot of these messaging platforms is they often don't know how to interpret a lot of messages, especially with these new forms of texting like emojis. It's often hard for them to understand what exactly the other person is conveying, and they often don't know what is the best way to respond. For them, texting might not feel like a very natural way of communicating like it is, like conversations are. So there's this gap that they currently face in terms of how they communicate, and they want to overcome that barrier. The third audience I'm thinking about is millennials, people typically in your young early 20s. What we noticed is that a lot of these people tend to use applications like Snapchat, Messenger, and they or iMessage, and they like that because they can kind of express themselves a lot better. There's more opportunities to send gifts. There's more opportunities to be more fun and creative with how you express yourself, and that kind of feature might be a bit lacking in WhatsApp compared to some of these other platforms. The last segment I'm thinking about are like police officers. For them, communicating with one another in a very secure way is very important, ensuring your messages are encrypted. They want a quick and easy way to kind of alert each other about potential crimes, status updates, and really they want something that's easy for them to use on their mobile phone. So I think that there definitely is some potential for police officers here to use WhatsApp as their go-to form of communication. With that in mind, the segment that I'm kind of the most interested in right now is going to be elderly people. And the reason for that is I think that with a lot of these other target audiences, like millennials, I think that they're already on an existing Facebook product. A lot of them are already using WhatsApp in a relatively are using WhatsApp and showing good engagement signs. But I think elderly people, there's this huge gap that still exists. And for them, a lot of them, I feel like, have onboarded onto the platform, but there's still this gap that there's still this huge gap that prevents them from engaging with it properly because there's still this jump, like huge learning curve that exists between the generations. So they often don't know how to communicate in the same way that a lot of other people, other demographics do. They don't know how to text effectively. They don't know how to interpret text in the same way. So I think there's a lot of potential here in terms of improving engagement for this specific customer segment compared to the others. So with that in mind, with our focus on elderly people, I'm going to go ahead and maybe think about what are some of the big pain points that they face, and go from there. Unless there's something you'd like to add, or if you'd like to change my course of action.
No, so it sounds like we enumerated some options, which is great. We identified kind of the various aspects of each, and we're going ahead with picking the elderly segment. So we're focusing on specifically that segment, that customer segment, in terms of how we're going to think about improving WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Cool, sounds great. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the elderly population segment. And yeah, I'd love for you to also kind of tell me a little bit more about some ideas you have and a product vision that you have around how we would improve it, or what kind of what is the vision of this improvement? Is it a feature? Regardless of whether or not it's a feature or a product, I'd like to just see kind of your product vision thinking here.
Yeah, sure.
But feel free to take your time to think if you need some time.
Yeah, so before I get started with the product vision, I think one of the things I'd like to do is kind of really kind of take a deeper look into kind of like what are the most critical pain points, and I think that'll help us create a more informed vision. So
Great.
If you'd like to give me a few seconds, I'll just like write down some of my thoughts and go from there.
Great.
Okay, so from my understanding, the first pain point I'd like to think about is more often than not, a lot of elderly people struggle on how to interpret a message. Like they struggle to understand what does the message's tone say about how the other person is feeling. For instance, if their child is emailing them, maybe they're concerned, but the person might not be aware of that. Um, so that's something that's very important, especially when there's all of these emojis and then there's all these new like short form ways of communicating. They might not understand a lot of these acronyms or the way that a younger audience communicates over text. So I think one of the things I'd like to think about is how do we help them understand these texts are getting better, understand the text that they're receiving much better. The second thing is they might often struggle on figuring out how to ways for them to express themselves. So basically here, what I mean is like they might have something that they intend to say, but they might not know what is the best way to express that. The third pain point I'd like to think about is remembering important conversation details and storing that information. So let's say that an elderly person gets a request from their kid that they should come over, let's say the next upcoming week because they're having a housewarming party or because they're having some kind of event. More often than not, when they're inundated with all these requests for them, it might be hard for them to figure out what's the best way to organize it, and it's very tedious, and they might fail to remember some information there. So that's a huge pain point I've noticed that elderly people face in terms of managing their conversations. So with these pain points in mind, I'd like to kind of the product vision I'm kind of thinking about here is building a beautiful like conversational assistant that kind of looks through these texts and it informs them, hey, here's what I think your son is feeling. I think he's a bit concerned. And then it comes up with some really smart suggestions on things to say that so that the elderly person could just tap on one of those suggestions, immediately send a text. So basically the idea behind this conversational interface is to be able to understand their text much better, being able to communicate with just taps and knowing what is the best way to express themselves. And it also might just take some information details, like about important conversation details, and kind of store that onto their calendar or keep them updated about that and use the interactive reminders so that they don't forget important information that comes out of these conversations. So in short, the goal behind what I'm proposing here is basically, in essence, to communicate the product vision here is to break down the barrier that exists in textual communication for elderly people so it feels as natural as having a conversation. Does that sound good?
Yeah. So overall, I mean, it sounds like we're understanding the pain points of expressing themselves, understanding conversational details, and storing that information in a great way, and then also kind of the pain points of connecting with younger audiences. I'm curious if you feel, and great product vision. I understand it, and we're gonna dive into that a little bit deeper in just a moment. But I'm just curious, like on the pain point of younger audiences and older audiences not understanding each other. Just a part of you feel like that's kind of by design. Like younger people use acronyms and emojis to kind of avoid being understood by their parents or to invent a new language. And how do you feel like that plays into kind of the product that you're describing right now? Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, to sort of clarify, you're saying that a lot of younger people like to use those kind of emojis and acronyms kind of to be a bit more ambiguous in the way they communicate.
Yeah, and they also just like they don't want to like if you think of children, you don't want to be seen by your parents. Like you don't want your parents to understand you. You kind of want to like be on a platform like Instagram and not have your parents around or not have older people around. And it's sort of like there's sort of maybe a tension between these two generations in terms of younger people don't like it when older people are kind of like polluting the space. And I'm just curious like how you see this, like younger audiences might continue to use confusing acronyms that your algorithm or your assistant may not be able to decipher easily because younger people keep using these new trends and new terms. Do you see like any resistance from the younger audiences to being understood by the older audiences in this platform? Or I just would love for your thoughts on that as it relates to your product vision.
Yeah. So with respect to that, the reason I kind of came with this more informed product vision was that because um, I felt that when you're thinking of WhatsApp, the kind of the intention behind it is not necessarily to kind of have those type of conversations where you're trying to basically kind of communicate in a way that in a way you would in Messenger or Snapchat where you're trying to be ambiguous. I think the whole intention is to kind of have like a more natural conversation. You're not going there to have like, it's not a place where you often have that same sort of playful conversation type that you'd have on Messenger. If you notice, like that's not the emphasis that the company's trying to create there. And I think when you look at the broader goal of the platform, that's not what I felt was that the company was trying to advance. So kind of tying to the broader vision of WhatsApp, I felt that this would be in line. But in terms of answering your question heads on, like how would we kind of deal with that when children do want to be ambiguous and kind of not reveal their intentions? I think in that case, basically if we're kind of struggling to basically if the tone of the conversation maybe lacks a degree of seriousness, then in that case we could kind of have a way of like maybe in that case we could have the assistant not like propose to like interpret a message in a certain way, and maybe you could just propose some like fun responses back, and maybe you could try to reciprocate that playfulness back. So in a way we could kind of look at the tone of the conversation and gauge like what sort of information we should lay out. So if it seems like they're deliberately trying to be ambiguous, instead of trying to interpret the message, we could be like, here are some fun responses back. So maybe you could like show them some GIFs, or maybe you could send some emojis back so they could bring some of that playfulness that the young audience has and kind of communicate in the same way back and forth. So that's one way of approaching this issue.
Cool. Great answer to kind of an out there question. So it sounds like we're going to, tie back to the broader vision of WhatsApp, which is that the point of WhatsApp isn't really as much about this kind of Instagram-y, like teenager kind of social sphere that's isolated from older adults. And also just like, being able to connect across generations seems like a really cool value prop.
Yeah.
I want to get into the product itself and this conversational assistant that you're suggesting. And I want to kind of hammer out like what that actually looks like. Can you take us through maybe a user journey of what using that conversational assistant might look like?
Yeah, for sure. If you could give me a second or so, I'll just like kind of write down some thoughts on like how I kind of envision this journey and then walk you through it.
Great. Sounds good. Yeah. And again, for those of you watching, this is a pmlesson.com live mock interview. I am here, I'm Steven, and I'm interviewing Sushant. Sushant got the Google offer, so we are kind of learning from his perspective on how to go through these PM interviews. I'm taking notes and we'll be giving feedback towards the end of the session as well. You are more than welcome / encouraged to chime in, specifically posting some comments. In the comments below, you can post some follow-up questions for Sushant, and I'll ask them. Anuj already has posted one, so thank you, Anuj, for doing that. And you're encouraged to react and to kind of play along in this experience as we go through it. And we hope that this is an educational and helpful tool for you as you go through your PM interviews.
Yeah, so I kind of have an idea of how this user flow is going to look like. So this is going to be number one if they decide to opt in to use this feature. So when we first launch this feature, we're going to ask elderly people, are you interested in opting in? And if they do opt in, here's what the flow looks like. Let's say they go onto WhatsApp and they have a list of conversations. Then they go into one of their conversations, and then let's say they receive a text. They go into one of their new conversations where they receive the text, and then the text pops up. But this conversational interface would be like, this system will be like an overlay on top. So it'll be in the top right corner, and it'll be like, once they get the text, it'll look and decipher the text and be like let's say the child asks, the child of the elderly parent asks, have you been eating? How's everything been going with you? Then the conversational assistant pops in the top right corner, and it's like, I think your kid might be a bit concerned for you based on his past few texts. And then they get an idea, and then of what exactly their kid is feeling. Then they're like, here are some suggestions on things you could say to cheer them up and also keep them aware of what you're doing. So it'll be like, they'll have like a response like, yes, I did. Or like, I did eat and things are going well. And then maybe it'll give a suggestion for like a happy GIF to send, or like a happy kind of emoji to send, so that they can warm up the other person's mood. So in essence, that's the first piece. The second piece is also like when something important pops up. It's like, hey dad, I want you to be here at 5 p.m. next week. We're having a party for the kids. Um, in that case, it'll be like the assistant will pop on the top right corner, just as it always does, and it'll be like this. It looks like should I store this event on your calendar? And the person could just simply click yes, accept it, and it gets integrated with their calendar, and all those relevant details get synced. So when that event comes, all that information is saved. So basically, how I envision this is it's not going to be this assistant is kind of going to be like a pop up on the top right corner of the where it doesn't really like interfere with the text. It's going to be like a small segmented out area. So it doesn't interfere with reading the text, but it just kind of comes up with these interactive suggestions and also gives them recommendations on what text to send and kind of things. Just ask them if there's any important information they'd like to store.
Gotcha. Cool. And thank you. That's a really clear picture. Calendar options seems really awesome. I have a couple follow-up questions, and then I want to get towards the end of the interview so that we can ask some of the questions that were asked in the comments. Just to give you a sense of time. So interesting ideas. My first reaction, and I'm curious how you feel the platform can mitigate this, is that we're talking about older adults who may not be able to use these devices as effectively as younger adults already. We've already identified that as kind of one of the pain points, right?
Yeah.
And now we're introducing new features and new things into the chat conversation. How are you going to balance this as a PM of introducing new features versus confusing the interface even more for an already confused audience?
Yeah. So the idea behind this entire like feature was, I think basically the way we're thinking about it is we're going from having conversations with typing, let's say before you'd have to type about like 20 to 30 characters to convey your message, to now what we're doing is we're essentially allowing them to get away with taps to communicate how they're feeling. So with smarter suggestions. So I think in theory, the trade-off here is we're kind of decreasing a bit of the screen real estate for like understanding the messages, but in the benefit we're giving to them is now they're able to communicate with taps, they're able to communicate with fewer clicks, and they're able to kind of decipher more complicated messages. So I think although we're adding another layer on top of it, and we might be decreasing the screen real estate from the actual messages, I think the gain here of being able to communicate in a few taps and being able to kind of overcome that language barrier overcomes that. So that was something I was thinking about when I first proposed this feature, but I think this is one of those cases where the additional feature kind of certainly does benefit the downside of having another layer onto your product, but because I just think it greatly simplifies how much effort or the amount of user friction required, the amount of friction in communicating.
Great. I have one follow-up question, and then we're going to get it to the audience comments and questions. So audience, please comment away with any follow-up questions that you may have. My last question, what trade-offs do you see in this kind of area? And I know you've written a blog post for PM Lesson about trade-offs and about how they're really important to a PM interview. So I'm sure you've already thought of some, but I'd love to hear your perspective on some trade-offs or some pitfalls that might appear when designing a feature like this.
Yeah, so the first thing is a lot of conversational interfaces are really clunky. Like number one, they might not know how to give a good suggestion to a given textual response, which often leads to like very, very poor experiences. I'm sure a lot of people have had this with Alexa or Google Home where they ask it a question and it's like, I don't know how to respond to that. Those type of scenarios can pop up in a lot, which could frustrate elderly people. So that's number one. Number two is interpreting the message in a wrong way. For example, if this conversational interface like kind of proposes that it says that the person you're talking to is actually sad when they're not, that completely changes the direction of the conversation, and it could actually lead to wrong information which could hurt you. So that's something we have to be really cautious about, and we should only make those suggestions when we're really confident and we have enough data to statistically be very confident that we can kind of gauge someone's emotions. We shouldn't be making those suggestions blindly. So those are two big pitfalls. Another one that comes to mind is I think when it comes to like suggesting responses, maybe now people are starting to converse in a way that's like not very natural, or they might not be saying things that they might have not otherwise said just for the sake of convenience. Maybe or suggestions that are surfaced up are not things that the person intended to say, but just for the sake of saving time, they might just default to those kind of responses, which kind of changes the trajectory of the conversation. And maybe people find that their conversations with elderly people are not as natural and organic as they once were. So that's another potential pitfall I see with this idea.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. Overall, excellent job with this interview. We're going to kick it to feedback soon, and I'm going to kind of walk through some feedback while also asking you some follow-up questions. We have 3 follow-up questions from our audience right now, so I just want to kind of shoot them at you, and I hope you're ready for the whole audience to interview you. And I mean, you're doing a great job, so I think it'll be great to get your perspective. So the first question that Alex Lee brought up that I think is a really good question to follow up right now is, how will you deal with these pitfalls that you just raised? So are there some initial maybe ideas? We don't have to get into it too much, but just in maybe a minute or so, how would you address some of the major pitfalls that you just identified?
Yeah. So let's go with the first one, right? When we can't come up with a good response to a question, like when that's not happening, how might we kind of surface off better suggestions? In that case, I think one option might just be to literally be like, literally kind of maybe help, maybe like instead of like coming up with responses or coming up with that, maybe we could try to like come up with like a suggestion on like telling them to start typing, or prompt them to start typing something, and then we could go from seeing what they're typing and make suggestions based on that. So I think in that case, the solution might be to nudge them to start the conversation and be like, hey, your person X wants you to respond. And then while they're typing the response, we can kind of gauge what they're looking at. And from that, we can kind of formulate suggestions. So that works in addressing pitfall number 1 in cases where we can't prompt them as to what to respond. Situation number 2, where we can't gauge the tone, or we can't simplify the message, or we can't gauge what the other person is feeling, and we might make a wrong suggestion. In that case, I'd say the default behavior is really we shouldn't be suggesting this emotions piece unless we're really confident. Like we shouldn't say he's angry or sad unless there's a really high degree of confidence as to the emotions. And as far as interpreting the messages, I think regarding that piece, I think we could do a few things. Number 1 is we could offer multiple potential interpretations of the message and let the person figure it out themselves. It's like, hey, here's what we think they might be seeing. Here are 2 options. And then let the person decipher for themselves. Or number 2 is, in that case, we might just be better off just again nudging them and not really offering any kind of message there. So that's kind of a way I'd address some of those pitfalls heads on.
Gotcha. Cool. Great answer to that question. And I'll just kind of start chiming in alongside you, Sushant, as we go through these, and the audience is also starting to ask, and audience, feel free to ask questions just generally for advice, or this can kind of be a little bit of a Q&A session as well with me and Sushant to answer those questions. I think that's a great perspective. I think one area that I would definitely emphasize is I really like that point about if you're suggesting something like an emotion, or if you're doing something that's that heavy weight, you really want to be positive that that's the right experience, and you want to give an escape hatch to users to get out of that experience. So let's say that it's wrong, that users can turn that off, can just say like X, like this is wrong, or like don't show me this again, this is really annoying. Because at any time that we try to kind of guess at a user's intentions, we just want to be really, really confident about it. And I think the second piece of this, which is just really important for your product overall, is the clarity and the like not confusing the users is really important design principle for this product. So being sure that we can focus on that and reduce clutter on the page as much as possible when we make these decisions. I think that's a good one of these kind of goalposts that you can use to decide how to prioritize or how to make decisions on these products or features. Cool. So there's a couple other questions. So Anuj asked the question, what would a North Star metric be for improving engagement for these elderly people, let's say with this product? So what is maybe a North Star metric, or a metric that you think is really important that you would double down and look at for this product? And we can do it quickly. It doesn't have to be a perfect answer, because I know we're kind of following up really quickly after.
Yeah. So I think obviously the goal here is to improve engagement. In that sense, we're thinking of how do we get people to send more messages, receive more messages, have more conversation. I think the actions related messaging are the number of messages sent, number of messages like received, and the session time that the user is kind of like how long is the how much time the user is spending on the platform. So with that in mind, I think I think a good North Star message might be to send is I guess we could look at number of conversations per day or even number of messages sent because if this product is doing its goal right, that means it should be having more conversations. That means there should be more messages being sent because they can understand conversations better. It's easier for them to send messages. So I think that those two metrics would be pretty important to look at as far as the North Star goes. But
Cool.
obviously, even with there are some flaws to that. Because let's say if they are understanding the conversation better, maybe they're able to kind of close off conversations a lot quicker. So maybe if we do focus on number of messages sent, maybe because there's less ambiguity now, they can have quicker conversations. So that's just something to keep track of. Like if our product is really achieving its goal, maybe they can accomplish conversations a lot quicker. So just something to keep in mind when we think of that.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great start. And I think, we could do a whole interview question just on the metrics for this product. So, it's a great question, Anuj, and we would love to do more on that. But I think that's just a sense or a flavor of how you go about it. I also posted in the comments below a link to Sushant's blog post. So go ahead and check it out. It's all about trade-offs and how to use them from a very tactical level in your PM interview. And I think it's a great read. I'm going to keep going through some of these questions. Rashmi, I think I answered your question a little bit earlier, but feel free to clarify if I didn't. Ankur, we have so Ankur has a last question, and let's do this as the last interview question before I do some feedback, and then we can jump into a casual FAQ kind of session, or Q&A session. Ankur asks, will suggestions change from person to person depending on with whom you are talking to? Will it customize for your different friends?
Yeah, I think the natural response here is it should naturally adapt to different people because the type of conversations you have with a friend is very different to conversations you have with your son, which is very different to conversations you have with your grandchild. Like I naturally think it should be adaptive, and if our product is really doing a good job, I think the way it analyzes conversations for each one of those people should allow it to make more personalized recommendations per user. But I think when we're looking at V1, obviously, when you're first launching this product, I think that might not be possible in the initial version just because I think the first point is to just get the basic functionality out there in the MVP. So I think this is something that you want to maybe bring out a couple months or in like V2 or a later iteration of the product.
Cool. Yep. I think that's totally the right answer. And it should totally be customized and personalized, especially in the messaging platform. All right. Well, Sushant, thank you so much again for doing this. I'm going to jump into feedback. You're still not free yet, and just give you some thoughts. Overall, I just wanted to say you totally crushed that. That was a great set of answers, and I thought you really thought through it really well. So excellent job and great example to the audience on what a great PM interview looks like and how to go about thinking about that. So I'm going to go through kind of the interview chronologically and highlight areas that I thought you did really well and areas where I thought that we may have been able to spend more time or improve that particular answer. In the very beginning, this is a really small thing, but we enumerated kind of the list of segments that we were considering: children, seniors, encrypted messages, etc. And one piece of advice for all PM interviewees is that enumerating the options is really helpful. And you did go through the enumeration of the options, but especially on a thing like a phone call interview, it helps to do something called the triangle method, where you kind of say the options in the beginning. You can say, my options are 1, children, 2, seniors, 3, encrypted messages. And then you go through all of them. And then at the end, you say, in summary, my options were 1, 2, and 3. And you say them again. The reason this is really effective on a phone interview is because it's so hard to really process what the interviewee is saying that it's really important to be redundant. If you were in an actual session with me, you might have written those down on a whiteboard and kind of gone through them. And then I would say that one area of a suggestion for all people watching, and I think it's generally going to be hard to do, but I would recommend picking user segments or double downing on user segments that you know well already. So if you do have a grandfather or like, a senior person that you're close with, that's good. And that's a great user segment that you know. And if you don't, it might be helpful, and you think you might use that in an interview, it might be helpful to read a little bit about the user segment, to understand their needs, to understand kind of a little bit more about them. Otherwise, we get to like sometimes in these questions, and I think we didn't do it here, but sometimes in these questions where we talk about elderly people or children, we get to very kind of like stereotypical views of them as users. And there are still a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different kinds of ages. Elderly people is you could be talking about 80 plus or 60 plus, or, who knows what segment you're actually talking about. So I think understanding those user segments, if you realize that you're picking them a lot, is really important. And there are resources and books online and platforms that are currently targeted to those audiences that you might want to look into. One of the reason I say this is one of the key insights is that elderly people don't like being called elderly people, or like it's kind of like there were many times in history where products tried to release products that were like blank for seniors or blank for older adults, and it ended up being a flop because who wants to buy that? Like, who wants to go into a grocery store and buy a product that like says that you're a senior? So that's kind of the user empathy piece. But overall, I thought this was great, and I think that it ended up being that the product we suggested sounded like a product that even I would be down to use. Like it sounded like the product could end up targeting a wider demographic. So I thought that was really great. I love that you did the pain points. I tried to push you a little bit towards the product vision earlier, and you were like, no, I want to do the pain points first. Awesome. Like, totally steer the interview the way that you feel like it should go. Obviously, if I gave you more pressure, then maybe you could change it. But like, make sure you really follow the PM lesson structure, which is like user segments, pain points, brainstorming solutions, giving a product that vision that actually stuck with me, and then moving forward. So I thought that was awesome. And the product vision was great. A product vision of kind of assistant, giving this assistant in your chat. Assistants are very popular nowadays, of course. But targeting a specific user segment, I thought, made it a novel concept and made it a new concept that was really great. I think that in general, I love that you tied things back to the broader vision of WhatsApp when I asked that follow-up question. And I think just in general, kind of one recommendation is that I felt like, again, since we didn't define the user segment as well, we don't know the user segment as well, we weren't able to develop features that were very specifically targeted to that user segment. So if we could do it over again, I think one of the big pieces of advice is really understanding that segment more, and totally get that like in an interview, you can't go and do user interviews and customer segment interviews. But just a thought that you might, having a little bit more context might have helped make this a even better interview. Lastly, I thought that you addressed the trade-offs really well. I think the failure thing is a really important piece. I was hoping you would mention something like that, about how this is we have to be very careful about doing this feature because we need like 99% accuracy if we're telling people how people feel. It's a pretty intimate statement to make. And then I thought that, in general, my last piece of advice, and I mentioned this before, but kind of it seemed like a design principle emerged halfway through, which is like clarity and reducing clutter and like making things really an easy user interface. And I think that ties back to the original pain point. So just make sure, and I think it's a helpful exercise, that when you get the product at the end, to look back at the pain points that you identified and make sure that they're addressing them and make sure that they're not causing more pain points. And that'd just be a great way to also generate more trade-offs, which is like, okay, we developed this product which addresses this piece, but it may exacerbate this other piece. And we should be very aware of that because we've already identified this pain point. Yeah. But in general, we're just always tying things back to kind of what our original statements were about the pain points in the user segment. I'll pause there. That was most of the feedback that I had. Overall, like super excellent interview, and it was great to kind of do this with you and learn from your style and your answers. Did you have any reactions to the feedback that I just mentioned?
No, I totally get with that. I think one of the things that I could have definitely worked on is kind of understanding my target audience a bit better. I think it's something all PM interviewees should do, like when they kind of propose some, like just look at what are some common characteristics, how do these people, what kind of products do they exist to buy, how do they react to different products? And I think it's something that not a lot of interviewees put enough time into. And I think that'll help come up with better ideas. So I think that's something I could have worked on a bit.
Yeah, totally. And it's great that you have that awareness. I want to get to a couple questions on that Wenyu has asked that seem more general. And again, audience, thanks for being with us. Feel free to ask a couple follow-up questions. I think we'll do about 2 to 3 total, and then we'll leave the session. So I want to start with Wenyu's first question, which is how to impress interviewers by asking good questions at the end of the interview. What questions do you suggest to ask? So I'm curious, Sushant, I have some ideas too, and I can go first if you'd like, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on good questions that you end up asking to the interviewer at the end of the session.
Yeah, so a good heuristic I like to use with these questions is if it's something you could Google online, just probably not a good idea to ask the interviewer that. Because if you can, like, for example, if you're asking them something generic about the company they work at, and if you could literally Google that and like find that information on the company culture online, that kind of shows that you've not really put enough thought into the type of questions you're asking. But if you ask them something very specific to the work they do or very specific to them, I think that shows a degree of thoughtfulness in your question. So that's something I'd really push on when you're asking these follow-up questions at the end.
Cool. Yeah, I totally agree with that one. Generally, I ask questions about kind of how decisions get made at the company. Specifically, I ask questions to the interviewer about their opinions about the product vision of the company. And yeah, there are a couple great questions that you can ask that really hint at like areas that are hidden below the surface of the company. And one recommendation in general is always to watch like the keynote or some kind of product vision presentation about the company before going there, and then maybe having some opinions or thoughts or questions after that. The second question from Wenyu is it better to provide different answers to each round of back-to-back interviewers if they ask similar questions? This is kind of an edge case. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this, Sushant?
So could you repeat that? Is it better to ask?
To provide different answers. So let's say you have back-to-back interviewers and they ask similar questions, like what's your favorite product and why? Do you change up your answer between those two interviewers, or what would you do in that situation? It's kind of an edge case, so I don't really have a clear opinion either. I don't know how you would think about that.
So if you do have a favorite product, chances are you might not be able to cover all the areas you wanted to about that one product in a given answer. So my suggestion would be not to really change the product or anything, but maybe change the type of insights you provide. Like maybe change like what is something else that frustrates you about the product, maybe change some more, give different ideas on improvement. So maybe you could keep the product idea the same, but you could just deliver new insights in each one of those answers. So that's how I think about that.
Cool. Yeah, I would say something similar to that for Wenyu. Just, kind of spice it up, change it up. And generally, I think it's probably not a problem. And generally, interviewers won't ask you the similar questions. Like at most companies, the interviewers will know what the other interviewers have asked, and they won't repeat questions. That's how they prevent stuff like that from happening. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for joining this session. I thought this was really fun, and it was great to have everyone interact. We got a lot of people actually ended up viewing and commenting and participating in the channel. So thank you guys for joining. Of course, you can always visit more content like this at pmlesson.com, where we have online courses and lessons targeted for your product management interview prep. We are a site and service and community dedicated to helping folks ace their PM interview and help give you the practice that you need in order to do really well. Thank you so much, Sushant, for being here with me today. You did a great job with the PM interview, and I thought it was a great opportunity for a lot of people to kind of chime in and challenge you as well.
Yeah, it was great. Great talking to you, Stephen. Had a great time going through this interview, and thanks so much, everybody, for chiming in.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, guys, and I'm going to end the broadcast now.